Jack Miller, a former firefighter burdened by guilt, retreats to an isolated cabin to escape his painful past. One snowy night, his lost Labrador Retriever, Hunter, reappears with 3 fragile puppies. The reunion forces Jack to confront his regret for abandoning her years ago, as Jack works tirelessly to nurse Hunter and her pups back to health. He discovers her remarkable resilience and rekindles his own sense of purpose. Through harrowing storms and moments of doubt, Jack transforms his once lonely cabin into a sanctuary for abandoned animals. Hunter becomes a symbol of hope, inspiring Jack and his community to embrace second chances. Together, they create a haven of healing, proving that redemption and love can overcome even the darkest of times. What did you think of Jack and Hunter's inspiring journey? Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to DG Story for more heartwarming tales. Hit the notification bell to ensure you never miss our next story. The cabin stood solitary amidst the vast, snow-covered wilderness of Colorado, nestled at the edge of a dense forest. It was a modest structure with a small chimney that puffed smoke against the gray winter sky. The world around it was silent, save for the occasional whisper of the wind that carried the scent of pine and snow. This was where Jack Miller had chosen to disappear. Jack, a former firefighter, had spent the past 5 years in self-imposed exile. His once vibrant spirit was now weighed down by regret and memories he couldn't outrun. The accident that claimed his partner's life during a wildfire continued to haunt him, as did his decision to leave behind Hunter, his loyal Labrador Retriever, during the darkest chapter of his life. At the time, Jack believed he was doing the right thing, giving Hunter a chance at a better life, but the guilt had never left him. The cabin was his refuge from the world, a place where he could fade into the background and live with his regrets in solitude. His days were monotonous, chopping wood, mending old furniture, and surviving the brutal winters that seemed to mirror his internal cold. On one such winter night, a fierce blizzard roared through the forest, rattling the cabin's windows and howling like a wounded animal. Jack sat by the fire, his hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee. The flickering flames illuminated the lines etched deep into his face. It was a night like any other until he heard the sound, a faint scratching at the door. Jack frowned, setting his mug down. First, he thought it might be the wind, but the sound came again, more insistent this time. A weak, desperate whimper followed. Rising to his feet, he grabbed the heavy flashlight from the table and approached the door cautiously. When he opened it, the wind hit him like a wall, carrying with it icy shards of snow. He shone the flashlight down and froze. There, on the threshold, lay a frail Labrador Retriever. Her fur was matted with ice and dirt, and her ribs showed through her thin frame. Beside her, 3 tiny puppies huddled together, trembling in the cold. "Oh, my God," Jack whispered, crouching down. The Labrador lifted her head weakly, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He knew those eyes. "Hunter," he breathed. The dog let out a soft whine, her tail giving the faintest wag before she collapsed again. Jack's chest tightened as he scooped her up carefully, gathering the pups in his jacket. He kicked the door shut against the storm and hurried to the fireplace. Gently, he placed Hunter on an old blanket near the fire and laid the pups beside her. They burrowed into her fur, seeking warmth. Jack worked quickly, fetching towels to dry them off and an old can of dog food he'd kept for reasons he couldn't explain. As the fire crackled and the room filled with warmth, Jack sat back and stared at the dog who had once been his closest companion. The years had been cruel to her, but there was no mistaking it. This was Hunter, the dog he had abandoned a decade ago. Guilt crashed over him like an avalanche. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. How had she survived all these years? And why had she come back now? Hunter stirred slightly, letting out a soft sigh. Jack's gaze shifted to the puppies, who were now sleeping soundly, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. "You found me again," Jack murmured, his voice cracking. "And you brought your family with you." He sat there for hours, watching over them as the storm raged outside. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. The blizzard raged on through the night, its relentless howls rattling the windows and burying the cabin under a thick blanket of snow. Inside, the warmth of the fire created a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Jack sat cross-legged on the floor, his gaze fixed on Hunter and her 3 tiny puppies. Hunter lay motionless, her body rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her fur, now dry, revealed patches of scars and a thin frame that spoke of years of hardship. The puppies snuggled close to her belly, their tiny forms seeking the comfort and warmth only she could provide. Jack reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against her head. Her eyes flickered open briefly, and she let out a faint sigh. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was trust. "You've been through hell, haven't you, girl?" Jack murmured. "I don't know how you found me, but you're safe now, I promise." The small stockpile of dog food Jack had stored in the cabinet was quickly dwindling. It had been years since he'd had a reason to keep it, but some part of him could never quite let go of the past. He emptied another can into a bowl and set it near Hunter's nose. Her ears twitched at the scent, but she was too weak to move. "You need to eat," Jack said softly. He broke the food into smaller pieces and held them near her mouth. After a moment, she licked at the morsels, slowly beginning to eat. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The puppies, however, were full of life despite their tiny size. Jack watched as one of them, a little golden-furred ball of energy, wriggled away from its siblings and stumbled toward him. The pup's curious eyes and unsteady steps brought a rare smile to Jack's face. "Well, aren't you a brave one?" he said, scooping the pup into his hands. It let out a tiny yip before nuzzling against his palm. "Looks like you take after your mom." Jack placed the pup back with its siblings, his heart aching as he realized how vulnerable they all were. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up, and the thought of venturing out to the nearest town for supplies was daunting. He didn't have enough food or medical supplies to sustain them for long. As the hours passed, Jack began to notice Hunter's breathing growing more labored. Panic gripped him as he realized she might not survive the night without proper care. His mind raced, recalling the first aid training he had received years ago as a firefighter. He rummaged through an old storage chest and found a basic medical kit. Kneeling beside Hunter, he carefully examined her for injuries. A gash along her hind leg caught his attention. It wasn't fresh, but it had festered. An infection had set in. "Damn it," Jack muttered, grabbing a bottle of antiseptic. "This is going to hurt, girl, but you'll feel better after." Hunter whimpered softly as Jack cleaned the wound, her body trembling under his touch. He worked as gently as he could, his hands steady despite the guilt gnawing at him. "I'm so sorry, Hunter," he whispered. "I should have been there for you." The storm outside began to ease by morning, but the cabin was still surrounded by towering drifts of snow. Jack stood at the window, his arms crossed as he weighed his options. Going out in these conditions could be dangerous, but staying put might mean risking Hunter's life. Behind him, the golden-furred pup let out a tiny bark, startling its siblings. Jack turned and couldn't help but chuckle. "Guess you've got the spirit to fight," he said. "Your mom's going to need that too." He crouched beside Hunter again, stroking her gently. "You've always been a fighter," he said, "and I'm not giving up on you now." With the storm finally subsiding, Jack began to prepare for the journey ahead. He packed a small bag with essentials, extra blankets, food, and the remaining medical supplies. He knew he couldn't take the puppies with him. They were too young and fragile to endure the trip. "You'll have to hold the fort while I'm gone," he told the pups, his voice soft but resolute. He leaned closer to Hunter. "I'll be back, I swear. Just hang on a little longer." The bond between them, once broken, was beginning to mend. As Jack stepped out into the biting cold, he glanced back at the cabin. the image of Hunter and her puppies etched into his mind. "I won't fail you again," he whispered to himself, his breath visible in the frigid air. Then he turned and began the trek through the snow, his determination burning brighter than the sun breaking through the clouds. The snow crunched beneath Jack's boots as he trudged toward the nearest town, each step a battle against the icy wind. His breath came in short bursts, visible in the frigid air, but his thoughts were far from the bitter cold. With every step, memories of his past with Hunter resurfaced, vivid and unrelenting. 10 years ago, Jack had been a man with a purpose. As a firefighter, he thrived on the camaraderie of his crew and the adrenaline of saving lives. Hunter had been his constant companion, a gift from his late father who believed every man needed a loyal dog. From the moment Jack brought the playful Labrador puppy home, they were inseparable. Hunter grew into a strong, intelligent dog who seemed to understand Jack better than anyone else. She accompanied him on hikes, waited patiently by the door after long shifts, and even became a familiar face at the firehouse, where the crew adored her. Jack often joked that Hunter was more popular than he was, but everything changed during a wildfire that tore through the forests outside Denver. It was the largest blaze Jack had ever encountered, and the stakes were higher than ever. He and his team had been called to rescue a family trapped in a cabin surrounded by flames. The mission was harrowing, but they succeeded in saving the family. On their way out, however, Jack's partner, Greg, became trapped under a falling beam. Jack tried desperately to free him, but the flames spread too quickly. Greg's screams echoed in Jack's ears as he was pulled away by other firefighters, forced to abandon his friend. The guilt of that day consumed Jack. He left the fire department shortly after, unable to face his crew or himself. His life spiraled as he withdrew from the world, pushing away everyone who cared about him, including Hunter. Jack couldn't afford to take care of her, struggling with his mental health and barely scraping by. He made the agonizing decision to return her to the shelter where he had first adopted her. He convinced himself it was for the best, that someone else could give her the life she deserved. But as the years passed, the image of Hunter watching him leave haunted him. He had failed her, just as he had failed Greg. Now, as he trudged through the snow to save her, Jack felt both shame and determination. "I won't let you down again," he muttered, the wind carrying his words into the empty expanse around him. When Jack finally reached the small town, he stumbled into the veterinary clinic, frost clinging to his beard and clothes. The receptionist looked up, startled by his disheveled appearance. "I need help," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "It's my dog. She's injured." The veterinarian, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Evelyn Carter, led Jack to a back room where he described Hunter's condition. "She's tough," he said, his voice cracking, "but she's been through a lot. Please, you have to help her." Dr. Carter nodded, her expression serious. "Bring her in as soon as you can. We'll do everything we can for her." As Jack prepared to leave, Dr. Carter asked, "What's her name?" "Hunter," Jack replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. "She's my hero." The journey back to the cabin was even more grueling, but Jack pushed through, spurred on by the image of Hunter lying by the fire, waiting for him. By the time he returned, night had fallen, and the cabin was bathed in the warm glow of the fireplace. Hunter lifted her head weakly as Jack entered, her tail thumping once against the floor. Jack knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he stroked her fur. "I found help," he whispered. "We're going to get you better. I promise." As he looked into her tired eyes, memories of their happier days flooded back. He remembered the way she'd always sit beside him during quiet evenings, her head resting on his knee, offering silent comfort. "You never gave up on me, did you?" Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "Even after everything, you found your way back." Hunter licked his hand gently, her eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope, not just for Hunter's recovery, but for his own redemption. The next morning, with the pups bundled in blankets, Jack carefully carried Hunter to his truck. The drive to the clinic was slow and cautious, the snow-covered roads glistening under the pale winter sun. Dr. Carter and her team were waiting when he arrived, ready to treat the dog who had endured so much. As Hunter was carried inside, Jack lingered near the door, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. He whispered to himself, "Please, just give me a chance to make things right." Jack paced anxiously in the waiting area of the veterinary clinic, his boots scuffing the polished floor. The warmth of the room did little to ease the icy dread gripping his chest. Every passing minute felt like an hour as he waited for news about Hunter. The receptionist offered him a cup of coffee, but Jack barely noticed her kindness. His thoughts were consumed with memories of the life they'd once shared and the promise he had made to never fail her again. Finally, the door to the examination room creaked open, and Dr. Carter stepped out, her expression a mix of concern and reassurance. "Hunter's stable for now," she said, taking a seat across from Jack. "She's severely malnourished and dehydrated, and the infection in her leg has caused some complications. But she's a fighter. I've cleaned the wound and started her on antibiotics. The next 24 hours will be critical." Jack exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but sincere. "Can I see her?" Dr. Carter nodded. "Of course, but she needs rest. Keep it brief." Jack followed her into the examination room, where Hunter lay on a soft bed, her leg bandaged and her breathing steady but shallow. Her eyes fluttered open when she heard him approach, and her tail gave a faint wag. "Hey, girl," Jack murmured, crouching beside her. He rested a hand gently on her head, feeling the warmth of her fur under his palm. "You're going to be okay. I'll make sure of it." Hunter let out a soft whine, her gaze steady and trusting despite her weakened state. Jack stayed with her until Dr. Carter gently ushered him out, reminding him that Hunter needed uninterrupted rest. Back in the waiting area, Jack settled into a chair, his exhaustion finally catching up with him. He leaned back, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as he replayed the events of the past few days. He hadn't felt this much purpose in years. The next morning, Dr. Carter informed Jack that while Hunter's condition had improved slightly, she wasn't out of the woods yet. "We'll keep her here for observation for a few more days," she said. "In the meantime, why don't you go home and rest? You've done everything you can for her." But Jack shook his head. "I can't leave her," he insisted. "She's already spent too much time alone." Dr. Carter smiled gently. "You're a good man, Jack. I can see how much she means to you." Jack spent the day helping out around the clinic, cleaning kennels and fetching supplies. It was his way of staying close to Hunter while keeping himself occupied. That evening, as he sat by her side, a nurse entered the room with a folder of paperwork. "While you're here, you might want to take a look at this," she said, handing it to Jack. "It's Hunter's records. Dr. Carter thought you'd want to know what she's been through." Jack opened the folder with trembling hands. The records detailed Hunter's journey after he'd left her at the shelter. She had been adopted briefly but returned when her new owners couldn't handle her energy. Over the years, she had been passed between homes and eventually ended up on the streets. Despite the hardships, she had survived, even raising her litter of pups against all odds. The weight of her resilience hit Jack like a freight train. Tears blurred his vision as he closed the folder, his heart breaking for the dog who had endured so much and still found her way back to him. That night, Jack sat by Hunter's bed, stroking her fur as she slept. "I'm so sorry for everything you've been through," he whispered. "I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you." 2 days later, just as Hunter was beginning to show signs of recovery, a sudden storm rolled into the town. Jack stood by the window of the clinic, watching as the wind whipped snow across the streets. Dr. Carter approached him with a worried expression. "The storm's worse than expected," she said. "Power outages have been reported, and our backup generator is unreliable. If it fails, Hunter and the other animals here could be at risk." Jack's stomach sank. What can we do? Dr. Carter hesitated. If the generator fails, we'll need to move the critical cases somewhere safer. But transporting them in this weather would be dangerous. Jack clenched his fists. If it comes to that, I'll help move her, whatever it takes. As night fell, the power flickered ominously, and Jack braced himself for the worst. He stayed close to Hunter's side, ready to act at a moment's notice. The power failed just after midnight. The hum of the clinic's machines fell silent, replaced by the distant howl of the storm outside. Jack shot to his feet, his heart pounding. Dr. Carter and her team scrambled to secure the clinic, their flashlights casting long shadows across the walls. We need to act fast, Dr. Carter said, her voice steady but urgent. The critical cases can't stay here without power. Hunter's one of them. We'll have to move her. Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. Where do we take her? There's an emergency shelter at the town hall, Dr. Carter explained. They have a reliable generator, but the roads are treacherous. It's a risk. It's a risk we'll take, Jack said firmly. He grabbed his coat and gloves, his breath visible in the icy air as he prepared for the journey. Hunter lay in her bed, her eyes fluttering open as Jack approached. She was weak but conscious, her gaze meeting his with a quiet determination. We're going to get you to safety, girl, he said softly, stroking her head. Dr. Carter brought over a sturdy crate lined with blankets. She'll be secure in here, she said, but you'll need to carry her. The snow's too deep to roll anything. Jack lifted the crate carefully, feeling the weight of Hunter and the responsibility he bore. Let's go, he said, his voice resolute. Stepping outside, Jack was immediately hit by the ferocity of the storm. Snow whipped around him, stinging his face and obscuring his vision. He adjusted his scarf and gripped the crate tightly as he trudged through the knee-deep snow. Dr. Carter and one of her assistants followed with supplies, their flashlights cutting faint beams through the swirling white. The wind howled, drowning out their voices, but they pressed on, driven by the urgency of their mission. Jack's muscles burned as he carried the crate, each step a battle against the biting cold and the unyielding snow. His mind raced with memories of the wildfire that had changed his life, the suffocating heat and choking smoke. This storm was its opposite, cold, relentless, and just as unforgiving. But this time, Jack refused to give in. He wouldn't fail again. As they neared the town hall, the wind intensified, nearly knocking Jack off his feet. He glanced down at Hunter through the crate's mesh door. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow but steady. Hang in there, girl, he muttered, his voice muffled by the wind. Dr. Carter shouted over the storm, pointing to a faint glow ahead. We're close, just a little farther. The sight of the town hall's lights spurred Jack on. With one final push, they reached the shelter's entrance, where volunteers hurried to help them inside. The warmth of the building enveloped Jack as he stepped through the doors, his legs nearly giving out from exhaustion. Inside the shelter, the volunteers quickly set up a recovery area for the animals. Jack placed Hunter's crate on a soft blanket and knelt beside her, his breath ragged. Dr. Carter checked her vitals, nodding in approval. She's stable, she said. You did good, Jack. Jack slumped against the wall, his head resting in his hands. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving him drained but relieved. He watched as the volunteers tended to the other animals, their compassion reminding him of why he'd chosen to be a firefighter all those years ago. Hunter stirred, her eyes opening briefly to meet Jack's. Her tail gave a faint wag, and Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. You're a fighter, aren't you? He whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Dr. Carter approached with a cup of hot tea, handing it to Jack. She wouldn't have made it this far without you, she said. Jack shook his head. She's the one who's strong. I'm just trying to keep up. As the storm raged on outside, the shelter became a haven of warmth and care. Jack stayed by Hunter's side, watching her sleep and reflecting on how far they had come. The guilt that had weighed on him for years began to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose. I lost my way, Hunter, he murmured. But you found me. You brought me back. The storm finally subsided by morning, the skies clearing to reveal a pristine blanket of snow. The town was still, the chaos of the night giving way to an eerie calm. Dr. Carter approached Jack with a smile. Hunter's looking better already. She'll need more time to recover, but I think she'll pull through. Jack felt a surge of gratitude as he looked down at his loyal companion. Thank you, he said to Dr. Carter, for everything. She shook her head. You're the one who brought her here. You didn't give up on her, Jack. That's what matters. As Jack prepared to take Hunter and her pups back to the cabin, he realized that his journey wasn't just about saving her. It was about saving himself. For the first time in years, he felt hope. The storm had passed, but the aftermath left the town blanketed in snowdrifts as high as fences, turning the roads into impassable trails. Jack stared out the window of the town hall shelter, sipping on a steaming cup of coffee. Hunter lay nearby, her pups nestled against her belly, and though she was still weak, her breathing had grown stronger. Dr. Carter approached, clipboard in hand. Hunter's stable, but she'll need ongoing care. Her leg wound isn't fully healed, and she needs proper nutrition to regain her strength, she explained. I'm worried about taking her back to the cabin in these conditions. Jack set the cup down and nodded. The cabin's isolated, but it's home. I've got supplies, and I can keep her safe there. If I stay here too long, I'll risk running out of food for all of us. Dr. Carter hesitated. You're sure you're up for it? The roads are dangerous. One mistake could leave you stranded. I've let her down before, Jack said firmly. I won't do it again. This is something I have to do. Dr. Carter placed a hand on his shoulder. All right, just promise me you'll call if you need help. And take these. She handed him a small medical kit and several packs of high-calorie dog food. These should get you through the next few days. By midday, Jack had loaded Hunter and her pups into his truck. The vehicle's tires crunched through the icy streets, and as the town disappeared in the rearview mirror, Jack felt a mix of determination and apprehension. The journey to the cabin, usually a 40-minute drive, would take much longer with the hazardous conditions. The snowplows hadn't reached the backroads yet, and the truck's tires struggled to gain traction. Jack gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the white expanse ahead. He glanced at Hunter through the rearview mirror. She lay quietly in her crate, her eyes half open as if sensing the challenges ahead. We've got this, girl, Jack murmured, just a little farther. As he turned onto a narrow forest road, the truck lurched to a halt. A fallen tree blocked the path, its branches heavy with snow. Jack cursed under his breath. Pulling the vehicle into park, he grabbed a hatchet from the back seat and stepped into the frigid air. The snow was knee-deep, and the icy wind cut through his jacket as he worked to clear the branches. Each swing of the hatchet sent splinters flying, but Jack's determination didn't waver. His mind replayed the moments when Hunter had fought for her survival, fueling his resolve. After nearly an hour of grueling work, the path was clear. Jack climbed back into the truck, his body aching but his spirit unbroken. He started the engine and continued down the road, his focus sharpened by the realization that every obstacle was another step toward redemption. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the fading light cast long shadows across the snow. The forest road grew narrower, and Jack's progress slowed. He tightened his grip on the wheel as the truck skidded slightly on an icy patch. Suddenly, a loud pop shattered the silence. The truck veered sharply to the side as the rear tire blew out, sending Jack's heart racing. He brought the vehicle to a halt and stepped out to assess the damage. The tire was shredded, and replacing it in these conditions would be no easy task. Jack retrieved the spare and tools, his fingers quickly numbing as he worked. The cold bit into his skin, and the weight of the tire tested his strength. As he struggled with the jack, he heard a faint whimper from the truck. Turning, he saw Hunter watching him through the crate's mesh door, her eyes filled with quiet encouragement. "I'm not giving up," Jack said aloud, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Not now." After what felt like an eternity, the spare tire was in place. Jack climbed back into the truck. Shivering but determined, he started the engine and pressed on. The cabin now only a few miles away. When Jack finally reached the cabin, exhaustion threatened to overtake him, but the sight of the familiar structure filled him with relief. The porch was buried in snow, and icicles hung from the roof like jagged teeth. But it was home. Jack carried Hunter and her pups inside, setting them gently near the fireplace. He stoked the fire until it roared to life, filling the room with warmth and light. The pups wiggled free from the crate, exploring their surroundings with unsteady steps. Hunter watched them, her tail wagging faintly. Jack knelt beside her, resting a hand on her head. "We made it," he said softly. "You're safe now." As the warmth of the fire seeped into his bones, Jack allowed himself a moment of rest. He leaned back against the couch, watching the flames dance in the hearth. Hunter, now lying comfortably with her pups, let out a contented sigh. For the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of peace. The cabin no longer felt like a place of isolation. It had become a haven, a place of healing and renewal. Looking at Hunter and her pups, Jack knew his journey wasn't over. Caring for them would be a challenge, but it was one he welcomed. They had saved him as much as he had saved them, and together, they would rebuild. The days following their return to the cabin were a test of endurance and patience for Jack. The snow outside was thick and unyielding, effectively sealing them in for the foreseeable future. Inside, the crackling fire became their lifeline, filling the cabin with warmth as Jack worked tirelessly to care for Hunter and her pups. Hunter's condition had improved marginally, but her movements were still slow, and the wound on her leg demanded constant attention. Jack cleaned and dressed it daily, speaking softly to her as he worked. "You're tougher than me, girl," he would say, his voice tinged with both admiration and guilt. The pups, on the other hand, were a bundle of energy. They explored every corner of the cabin, their tiny tails wagging with uncontainable excitement. Jack couldn't help but smile at their antics, though the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. One night, as a gentle snow began to fall outside, Jack sat by the fire with Hunter at his side. The pups had finally settled down, curling into a sleepy heap on a blanket near the hearth. Jack gazed into the flames, his thoughts drifting. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he admitted, his words directed more at himself than anyone else. "Like I have a purpose." Hunter turned her head to look at him, her amber eyes reflecting the firelight. It was as if she understood, her gaze steady and unwavering. Jack reached out to stroke her fur, a quiet moment of connection passing between them. Suddenly, Hunter's ears perked up, and she let out a low growl. Jack's hand froze mid-motion. "What is it, girl?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. Hunter rose to her feet slowly, her body tense as she stared at the door. Jack followed her gaze, straining to hear what had alerted her. First, there was only silence, but then he heard it, a faint crunching sound, as if footsteps were approaching the cabin. Jack's heart raced, grabbing his flashlight and the small axe he kept by the door. He motioned for Hunter to stay close. The pups stirred but remained huddled together, oblivious to the growing tension. Jack opened the door cautiously, the cold air biting at his skin as he stepped outside. The beam of his flashlight swept across the snow-covered clearing, illuminating nothing but endless white. The crunching had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. "Hello," Jack called out, his voice steady despite the unease curling in his chest. There was no response, just the whisper of the wind through the trees. Jack stood there for a long moment, scanning the darkness before finally stepping back inside. Hunter remained by the door, her growl subsiding but her posture still alert. Jack locked the door and crouched beside her. "It's okay," he murmured. "We're safe." But as he looked into her eyes, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been out there. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered landscape. The brightness felt like a blessing after the tense night. Jack took the opportunity to check the perimeter of the cabin, searching for any signs of disturbance. What he found startled him. Tracks. They were faint but unmistakable, leading away from the cabin and into the dense woods. Jack crouched to inspect them, his brow furrowing. They were human footprints. Returning to the cabin, Jack's thoughts swirled with questions. Had someone been watching them? And if so, why hadn't they approached? Shaking off the unease, Jack refocused on his immediate priorities: Hunter and her pups. The day passed quietly as he tended to their needs, the cabin filled with the soft sounds of crackling wood and playful barks. By evening, Hunter showed signs of significant improvement. Her appetite had returned, and she even managed to take a few steps without Jack's assistance. The sight filled him with a profound sense of relief and gratitude. "You're amazing. You know that?" he said, crouching beside her. Hunter wagged her tail, the faint motion enough to bring a smile to Jack's face. As night fell once more, Jack sat by the fire, the pups climbing over his lap in a playful heap. Hunter lay nearby, her head resting on her paws, her eyes watching Jack intently. For the first time in years, Jack allowed himself to dream of a future. The cabin, once a place of isolation and regret, had become a sanctuary. He thought about how he could use the space to help more animals like Hunter, creatures who had been abandoned or lost, just as he had been. The idea sparked a warmth in his chest. "We could make this place something more," he said aloud, his eyes meeting Hunter's. "A haven for all of us." Hunter's tail thumped against the floor, her silent agreement sealing Jack's resolve. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside the cabin, there was only warmth, love, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. Jack leaned back, a contented smile on his face, as the pups snuggled closer. The weeks after the storm brought a new rhythm to Jack's life. The snow began to thaw, revealing patches of brown earth beneath the once immovable white blanket. The once isolated cabin, surrounded by towering pines and mountain silence, now buzzed with a quiet vibrancy. Hunter had made a remarkable recovery. Her leg wound was healing well, and her strength was returning day by day. She moved around the cabin with confidence, her tail wagging with a vitality Jack hadn't seen in years. The pups, now healthy and thriving, had grown bolder, turning the cabin into their personal playground. Jack often found himself laughing as they tumbled over one another, their boundless energy filling the space with joy. But Jack's transformation was just as profound as Hunter's. The man who had once sought solitude to escape his pain now found purpose in connection and care. The cabin, once a place to hide, had become a sanctuary not only for Hunter and her pups but also for Jack himself. One sunny morning, Jack sat on the porch, sipping a cup of coffee as Hunter lay at his feet. The pups played nearby, their little barks echoing through the clearing. Jack's gaze drifted to the forest beyond, where life was beginning to stir with the coming spring. He reached down to scratch behind Hunter's ears. "You know," he began, his voice thoughtful, "this place could be something more, not just for us, but for others like you, like us, who need a second chance." Hunter tilted her head, her eyes meeting his as if she understood. The idea had been forming in Jack's mind ever since their return to the cabin. He thought about the other animals out there, struggling to survive in the harshness of nature or abandoned by the people they trusted. The cabin had space, the land was abundant, and Jack had the skills and determination to make it work. The next day, Jack drove into town with Hunter by his side. He visited the local animal shelter, introducing himself to the staff and sharing his idea. "I want to create a sanctuary," he explained, "a place where animals who've been abandoned or need care can find safety. I've got the land, and I'm willing to put in the work. I just need some guidance to get started." The shelter director, an older man named Tom, listened intently before breaking into a smile. "That's a big undertaking, Jack," he said, "but it's a good one. I'll help you however I can." With Tom's support, Jack began the process of transforming his cabin into a sanctuary. He built additional enclosures and shelter spaces, repaired the old barn on the property, and even started planting a garden to grow fresh food for the animals. As the weeks turned into months, the sanctuary began to take shape. Word spread throughout the community, and soon people were bringing animals in need to Jack's doorstep. Stray dogs, injured birds, and even a few cats found their way to the growing refuge. Hunter became a symbol of the sanctuary's mission. Her story of survival and resilience inspired everyone who met her, and she seemed to take on the role of guardian for the other animals. She often lay near the entrance of the property, her watchful eyes ensuring every new arrival felt safe. Jack kept a journal documenting the sanctuary's progress. Each entry was a reflection on how far they had come and a reminder of why they were doing this. One night, as he wrote by the fire, he glanced at Hunter and the pups curled up together. "You've changed everything," he murmured, his voice filled with gratitude. "You brought me back to life." One morning, Jack stood at the edge of the property, looking out at the land he had once seen as a place of isolation. It was alive now, filled with the sounds of animals and the laughter of volunteers who had come to help. Tom approached, handing Jack a cup of coffee. "You've done something amazing here," he said. "Not everyone would have the strength to turn their pain into something so good." Jack smiled, his gaze drifting to Hunter, who was playing with her pups near the barn. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "Hunter showed me how to fight. She showed me what it means to keep going, no matter how hard it gets." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jack felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The guilt that had once consumed him had been replaced by purpose. The sanctuary wasn't just a place for animals to heal. It was where he had found healing too. That evening, as the day faded into twilight, Jack sat on the porch with Hunter by his side. The pups, now strong and full of life, chased fireflies in the fading light. The air was cool and filled with the scent of pine, and the cabin glowed warmly in the distance. Jack rested a hand on Hunter's head, his heart full. "We did it, girl," he said softly. "We found our way back." Hunter leaned into him, her tail wagging gently. Together, they watched as the stars began to appear in the night sky, each one a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always light to be found.